What is up, fools? It is February 9th, 2021. It's a Tuesday for those of you keeping track, at least by Arabic numerals and the calendar as we know it that exists, which is strange. Somebody posted on Twitter yesterday, if you fly to Mars, there is no 365 days in the year. It's like, wow, that's fucking mind-boggling. Anyways, it's just wild. You go anywhere else in the universe and a day is different. You know, we don't even know if they use days. They use days, weeks, months, years. Does any of this stuff even matter? I mean, it's all stuff conceived of by humans. So theoretically, when you go to another planet and if there's life there, you know, who knows? And then it becomes a bigger question, like, what is time? Well, what's this thing that's aging us? If the numbers and the dates and stuff don't matter, we're all kind of on this linear path going from one direction forward somewhere because we're getting older, right? So what the hell is going on out there? You know, time is a human construct, but I guess some of it exists out there. It's wild. Anyways, we're going to get into other anomalies today. And it's just a coincidence. I was on that line of thought, and we got Mick West on today to try to debunk some alien shit. First, before we get started, though, I want to shout out my patrons who are people that make this podcast possible. My patrons are people that sign up and donate a monthly recurring sum to help support the podcast. I love them. You should love them, especially if you love the content. So let's give them some love. I'll give you the 2 rules for today's podcast, and we'll get on with it. First and foremost, my man, George Gammon, over at the Rebel Capitalist Pro platform. If you listen to this show because you are an investor or a trader or you're interested in finance and you want to take your knowledge one level up from where mine is, which is basically, mine is at the very bottom. This is not investment advice, remember. I would recommend that you check out Rebel Capitalist Pro because George Gammon, Lynn Alden, and Chris McIntosh know what they're talking about. You're going to get real concentrated information, especially on macro, but on the whole thing from a, Austrian perspective, from a perspective that's skeptical of the system, which I know many of my listeners are, which I know I am, which is why I like having George on, which is why I like being on his show, which is why I love the fact that he's a patron, because it's easy to shout him out. I know him. He's smart. He's a nice guy. His platform is worth it. I am a member. The link to that is in my podcast description if you want to check it out for yourself. If you need any help, contact George. His contact info is all over the place. He's a nice guy. Tell him QTR sent you, and we'll get on with life. This podcast also brought to you by my exclusive gold and silver provider over at JM Bullion. It is the only place that I order my physical gold and silver bullion. That is not a lie. That is no bullshit. It is. Why? Because they turn around my orders quickly. They ship the same day. They always seem to have inventory in stock. And I like the guys over there very much. They're nice, easy, relaxed to do business with. Even when they became a supporter of the podcast, I enjoy speaking with them. 2 guys over there, Rob and Rob. Very nice guys. So also, by the way, want to thank Kathy for her continued contributions at JM Bullion, but she has moved up at the company. And so now QTR podcast listeners have the lovely Laura, Laura, at jmbullion.com. If you want personalized service, email Laura. Tell her you're a QTR podcast listener, and she will work with you. This way you don't have to navigate the website, and you can have a more personalized experience if you're into buying gold and silver, if you're into that kind of stuff. They've been in business for a decade. They've done over $3 billion in sales, folks. JM Bullion, we like them very much. Link to them is also in the podcast description. This podcast also brought to you by the Lucci Steam Room. It's one of a kind, the Lucci Steam Room. They are Lucci and Wall Street Jesus. You know them. I know them. They're basically a household name at this point when it comes to options trading. They are the original OGs of options trading. I have known these guys for a decade. Their platform, the Steam Room, is a constantly evolving, beautiful piece of software that helps you look at where the big money is coming into the options market, which can be very lucrative information if you play in the equities market. And it's just nice to know where the steam is coming in on the street. A lot of times you see steam come into a big name. What does that mean? It means, hey, something might be up. Maybe you want to raise your eyebrows. And there's no better piece of software that lets you do that than the Lucci Steam Room. If you want to check it out, you want to try it for free, get in touch with Lucci, get in touch with Charlie Bathgate. All their links are in my podcast description. Let them know that I sent you. Tell them you're a listener. Tell them you want them to work with you. They will make all your dreams come true. It's the kind of piece of software, and by that I mean this is not a endorsement that they will make all your dreams come true, but they're nice people to work with, and they'll work with you. Oh, I've said too much. Here come the lawsuits. Anyways, check out the Steam Room. Great platform, great guys. Can be lucrative if you don't use it like an idiot. And that's it. This podcast also brought to you by my friends at the Trader's Path, which is one of my favorite day trading communities. If you're looking for a community of people to surround yourself with on the daily, pass around ideas, daily watch lists, investor education, Sunday night scans. Pete does some great Sunday night scans for the week ahead. Check out the Trader's Path. It is a no bullshit trading service run by another honest guy that I like, my buddy Pete Hedges. And the links to all those wonderful people and wonderful services that I actually know are actually honest people and that I actually endorse, not just because they are supporters of the podcast. That's all in my podcast description. What do you think about that shit? This podcast also brought to you by Investors Underground and my friends at Traders for a Cause, my favorite charity. Corvus Gold, Ken R., Chris Bede, Nicholas Parks, Matthew Zimmer, Jay Mintzmeyer, Russ Valenti, my homeboy, Creighton Titus. Hey, Russ was just at the Super Bowl. Big Tampa Bay fan. Congratulations. And some of my newest patrons, Tyler and Tom Smalley. Charlie Yu is in the house. John Grovum, thank you, brother, for signing up. Bryce Martell, Hot Butter, and ELA is in the house. Justin Katz and Reese Holcomb, user 1234. All my friends that checked in on PayPal, too, I appreciate the shit out of you guys. How about some older patrons like Judy White still with me and Tyler Bonneman, Justin Vaccaro, Patrick Flynn, Creepy Old Person, I think this says. Creepy, oh, I can't say it. I don't want to say that. You know who you are. Thanks for the continued Patreon support. Pivotal Capital, what's up, homeboy? All right. Rules for the podcast. There is a 3-drink minimum for this podcast, always and forever. Finally, we're going to get this in under the 7-minute mark. This podcast is not investment advice, life advice. I hold no licenses, no registrations. Please don't listen to anything I have to say. Do everything in your own life at your own risk. Enough said. Let's get started. All right. Very happy to have a friend of mine on the podcast today from metabunk.org, Mick West. He is a science writer. He is a skeptical investigator and retired video game programmer. He programmed the Tony Hawk Pro Skater series, of course, which was one of my favorites. You've probably seen him on Joe Rogan or numerous other podcasts that he does, but his site, Metabunk, is also awesome. I wanted to have... So I had Mick on back last summer, and I have never gotten so much hate mail from a podcast before. I absolutely loved it. And I like to have Mick on because in terms of preeminent debunkers, people that can explain themselves well, people that in my opinion, do the best job of making debunking digestible for people without coming off as, pompous or arrogant, because immediately conspiracy theorists always go to that, these pompous scientists, these pompous, facts getting in the way of things. And so I was very happy to have Mick West on over last summer to try to debunk whatever we talked about for 2.5 hours. But more specifically, over the last, couple of years, I've been following the Bob Lazar story all the way back since he had been on Art Bell, which was like back in the 90s when this story broke in Las Vegas. And I had followed it loosely. And then all of a sudden, 5 years ago, the story started to become a thing again. Lazar kind of went off into the ether somewhere. And then he had this brilliant resurrection over the last 4 or 5 years where Jeremy Corbell has done this documentary about him, and he's been on the Joe Rogan podcast, and of course now he's written a book, and his story has bubbled up from underground once again. And so what I did was, and I want to believe Bob Lazar, and we'll talk about what I think about his claims during this podcast. But over the course of doing my own investigation, I could never get past, Stanton Friedman's old criticism of, hey, if he lied about his education, there really doesn't seem to be any proof to validate his education. Well, what else is he lying about? And so I reached out to Mick West because I've been really begging for somebody to talk to me about this. If you noticed on my past podcast, I would bring it up with people once in a while. Nobody understands it. Nobody listens to it. Nobody really understands what the hell's going on. So I reached out to Mick last month, and said, hey, you want to come on and debunk the Lazar thing? And he said no. And I was like, so I just badgered him via email. And he said, all right, give me a month or whatever. So we decided on February 9th, and it's February 9th. And Mick West, what's going on, dude?
Woohoo. Well, yeah. Well, the reason I kind of didn't want to talk about Bob Lazar was that, I felt like I didn't really know that much about him. Obviously, I'd seen like the stuff that had come up over the last few years with him being on Joe Rogan and with the Corbell stuff. But, when you start digging into this, there's just so much information out there. And it's not just there's like, a lot of stuff that Bob Lazar has put out. There's lots of stuff that other people have put out looking into Bob Lazar. So if you start, just do a little bit of Googling, you end up finding people who were debunking him like many, many years ago. Like you mentioned Stanton Friedman. And he did like this he did something back in 97, I think, where he looked at just some of the claims that Lazar had made and just basically concluded he was a fraud and didn't want to go further, didn't want to go forward with that. But there's all kinds of interesting things in Lazar's history, which I wasn't even aware of until I started digging into it, like his multiple wives and the things that happened to them and things like that. It's quite fascinating.
Yeah, the interesting thing about his story is that, and I think the thing that makes it difficult for some people to immediately reject it is there is, in my opinion, just based on what I know offhand, and we'll compare notes, but there are some shreds of truth to some of the things that he says. And I feel like the actual objective truth is somewhere between, he's a total fraud and and everything he says is the truth. I think there's some things that are completely true and some things that are total bullshit. What does that sound like to you, Mick?
That sounds good. Obviously, there's some things he says that he was doing that you can kind of verify. Like, he was, his name shows up. Maybe we should like kind of go through real quick the kind of timeline just so that we're on the same page here.
Yeah, let's do it. Go ahead.
Yeah. All right. So, like from what I know, it's funny. I was writing out a timeline. And one of the things I wanted to do was put it in context, like historical context. So I started back in 1947. I'm not going to go into much detail, but 1947 was the Roswell event. People are familiar with that. 1961, the Barney and Betty Hill abduction, which is kind of where the idea of little gray men from Zeta Reticula comes in. Like these Barney and Betty Hill, this couple, claimed they were abducted and probed by aliens. It's kind of the classic alien abduction thing. Then fast forward a few years to 1977 when the movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind came out, which I think like kind of further cemented this whole idea of little aliens in everybody's mind. And then we get to Bob Lazar, and he claims to have graduated MIT in 1982 with an MS in physics, I believe, from MIT. I think he claims two different places where he got. Oh, it was MS in physics from MIT and an MS from electronics.
Yep.
From the California Institute of Technology, Caltech. And that was in 1982. And then he says he went to work at the Los Alamos National Lab in the Particle Accelerator Division. And his name shows up in the Los Alamos National Lab phone book from 1982. But it's got this little mark next to it, KM, which stands for Kirk Meyer, which was like a subcontractor who did work at the Los Alamos National Lab. And so it's not clear what he actually did there. And it's also not clear if he has these credentials, but we're going to get to that in a bit. Then a bunch of stuff happened between 82 and 88. He had a lot of financial issues and it ended up declaring bankruptcy in 87. And he was married to one woman. And then he apparently, from what I read, left her and married another woman. And then his first wife committed suicide 2 days later, which is obviously a pretty dramatic and traumatic event. And then he had to remarry his second wife, because I think he was technically still married to the first wife when he married the first wife, when he married the second wife. But this is just kind of like a bunch of interesting things that happened between him being in Los Alamos, he's showing up in the phone book, and then in 1988. And in 1988, he met a guy called John Lear, who is the son of the guy who invented the Learjet, Bill Lear, I think, your father, and claims at that time that he decided to get back in the game. And he says he calls up Edward Teller, the famous physician who he met back at Los Alamos, and then gets a job working at this place called S4, which is a division of, not a division, it's an area south of Area 51, which is where he was tasked with back engineering flying saucers, and he got to see a whole bunch of flying saucers and look at them. That only lasted a few months, and apparently he was caught showing people something in the desert and fired. So he claims. There's some video of this. And shortly after that, he started anonymously giving interviews to George Knapp, a local journalist, and under the name of Dennis, and then quickly came out as his real self, and then started telling this really complicated, long story about him analyzing these flying saucers, a story from which he has not diverged very much to this day. And that's about the long and the short of it. And I suppose, like, since then, basically, he has been this figure in ufology, someone who, George Knapp actually kind of refers to this case as being the thing that kind of made his career, like George Knapp's career.
Yeah.
Which is an interesting thing. We can also talk about that. And that's kind of something that's actually continued to this day. I mean, George Knapp is still doing shows about Bob Lazar.
Yeah, he just did Rogan too, like 2 weeks ago, I think, or about a month ago, maybe.
George Knapp?
Yeah, him and Jeremy Corbell, of course, had to be there as well in the side carriage.
Yeah, Jeremy Corbell has kind of emerged as being the protege slash heir apparent of George Knapp, and is kind of like taking over with the producing of things. Yeah, it's a kind of a different style, though. I kind of like George Knapp. He's a fairly smart guy.
I do too.
Yeah, but I think Corbell is of a different ilk. He's a lot more dramatic.
He's never met an unsubstantiated claim that he doesn't love.
Yeah, and is I don't know. You look at the films he does, like these documentaries, and they're very, very dramatic. It's all about weaponizing your curiosity, and there's big shots of the rotating galaxy and these brightly colored things and this high drama and stuff. It's just. It's not my cup of tea, I must say.
Well, when I watched the Bob Lazar and Flying Saucers, which was what really kicked off, I think, this most recent PR tour, right? Corbell found Lazar, or Lazar found Corbell, and they decided they were going to do the movie. And I think that's what kicked off this resurgence a couple years ago of them going out and telling the whole story again. So I was very excited to watch the movie because having followed the story closely for, a couple of decades, I was interested to see what was new. And the documentary really came off as quite, I don't really know how to describe it. I felt like the documentary was more about Jeremy Corbell than it was about Bob Lazar. There's these like dramatic scenes where he's texting Bob, and the camera is on Jeremy Corbell a lot during the documentary. It's quite baffling because
it's like the first 20 minutes or so is kind of Corbell, and then there's this weird scene where I think he's texting Lazar, and Lazar is saying that there's federal agents like coming to his house or something like that. I think this relates to the time when they raided his lab for selling illegal firework ingredients. But that was pretty much just a recreation of that. But he passed it off as being something that actually happened in the film. But yeah, it's a lot of drama and not a lot of facts. And I think this is kind of perhaps a defining characteristic of the whole Bob Lazar thing, is that we got essentially a fairly superficial exposition from Lazar. Bob Lazar is supposed to have an MS in physics, which is a pretty advanced physics degree. But the things that Lazar talks about are really kind of like superficial. He gives these very simplistic explanations of physics, which often don't really make any sense. And you don't really see Lazar getting into the details. He's kind of glossed over in a way that sounds good, but really doesn't have very much content. Kind of in the same way that Jeremy Corbell's work usually is more sound and fury than something that actually signifies anything. And I think if you look at the things that Lazar says, he says them very well. He's kind of a glib person. He has a quick answer, and he kind of phrases things and says things in a way that sound genuine. It sounds like he's genuinely recalling things, and he does a good job of being skeptical of things when they talk about other people and their encounters or their claims or whatever, and he does a good job of being like the voice of reason there. But then he also has his own extreme claims. And then he goes on and says, I know people won't believe this, and actually I prefer it if they wouldn't believe it. And so I think he's doing a really good job of making himself believable without really saying anything that you could actually use to verify, not just his credentials, but his understanding of physics.
Yeah, he almost manages expectations. That's one thing I've noticed. Like, in addition to what you're saying about his ability, even if he's not telling the truth, his ability to recall what his answer is for a particular question quite well.
Yes, yeah, and he's. He says he doesn't like the spotlight, and he gets very nervous and everything. But if you look back, he did a documentary with a guy called Gene Huff, who's been involved in the whole thing from the start, and he does a very good job of standing up in front of the camera and explaining these things without any kind of self-consciousness or whatever. So he doesn't really seem like he's afraid of the spotlight. A lot of these people, they say they're afraid of, they don't like the spotlight. Like, what's his name? David Fravor. Right. Yeah, you see him like in the Vice documentary, saying, "Oh yeah, I don't like this the spotlight. I don't like people who seek out the spotlight." And then the next shot of him is him sitting in on the top of a car going down this UFO like Mardi Gras parade as the guest of honor.
Right.
So yeah, it sounds good to say that you don't want the spotlight. It's kind of adds credence to your story. But yeah, I guess like that kind of gets into what is the motivation of people when they're doing these things. It's all kind of unclear, at the time, and now we're talking about like over 30 years later. Yeah, he first was interviewed by George Knapp in I think 1989 when he did his anonymous interviews. And then there's the whole cast of characters from back then. There's him, there's Lazar, there's George Knapp who did the interviews. There's John Lear who apparently introduced Lazar to George Knapp, and then there's the other guy, Gene Huff, who was there at the time. I think he was supposedly a realtor at the time. And John Lear tells this story about how they all met, and John Lear was quitting the UFO business, and then Huff called him and said, "Can I have all of your files?" And then Huff says, "I'll come and do an appraisal of your house if you let me have all your UFO stuff." It sounds like this ridiculous story. So he comes and he does the appraisal of the house, and the guy who's holding the other end of the tape measure is Bob Lazar, and Bob Lazar overhears Gene Huff and Lear talking about UFOs and says, "Oh, that's kind of crazy. I hold a Q clearance, and I would have heard about that." And then they just keep talking. Apparently, they convince him that this stuff is real, and then they all keep talking about it, and eventually they persuade Bob Lazar, or he persuades himself that he's going to get back into the game, and so he calls up Edward Teller, who he happens to know from a long time ago, apparently, and then gets a job reverse engineering flying saucers.
Wasn't the story that Teller bumped into him somewhere and recognized him from the front of the paper in Las Vegas because Lazar had built a car that was powered by a jet engine, and Teller was standing around reading the newspaper or something, and Lazar walked up to him and said, "Hey, that's me on the front of the newspaper."
Well, I think the way I heard it from, probably there's various different versions of it, but Lazar said that Teller was giving a talk at Los Alamos.
Right.
And he met him there, and I think they might have mentioned talking about the rocket car that he was working on, and they just talked, and I don't know what Teller actually thought of him at the time, and I think there's a short clip of video of somebody asking Teller about Lazar, and Teller just kind of refuses to talk about it because he seems like he's not interested in the subject, or at least he claims not to be interested in the subject. So it's it's kind of, again, like, these things are lost in history, because this would have been in 89 again, or no, would it be in 88? Yeah, 88. This happened, and it's 33 years ago. It's quite ridiculous, really.
Well, and I want to try to take this in some kind of order. Okay, I imagine you've got this organized in an order, and I have some questions. But while we're on the topic of just the motivation, I'm sure you watched the Joe Rogan podcast with Lazar and Corbell, and that's probably the thing that's most fresh in my mind. I've probably watched the whole thing start to finish probably 50 times, I would say, since it came out. And because really, I'm an analyst for a living. And so I like when I'm given 3 hours worth of, deposition, essentially, to try to examine, especially when it's something like this that I've been enamored with for years. What I noticed about the timing in that interview, and of course, he claims to have a migraine headache during that interview, and he stops, and the only time he doesn't answer questions directly and smoothly, like we were just talking about now, is when Rogan starts to get into the weeds a little bit about element 115, and he asks him, I think, like some kind of question that's off the beaten path a little bit, something that wasn't in his book, something that wasn't, that I hadn't heard the answer from him prior. I don't know what it is right off the top of my head, but it's like a second tier question about the whole element 115 thing. And he just sits there quietly, and then Corbell interjects, "Oh, the world will forgive you for having a migraine, Bob." And Corbell interjects several times during that interview. Notably, I think within the first 20 or 30 minutes, he's on it immediately, saying, Joe asked him a question, and Corbell comes right out and says, "Look, Bob doesn't need to be here. He gets so much shit from so many people, and, he's just doing the whole world a favor here by being here today, and, he doesn't want to do this, like you said, and he doesn't care if anybody believes him, et cetera, et cetera." And from right there, when I see those things, first off, when I see how eager he is to kind of jump in and defend him, it tells you about the lens he's looking at the whole story through. I mean, he's probably not being objective from the get-go. But yeah, I found...
Well, I think Corbell is looking at it from a story point of view. And it's very much, from his perspective, it's about communicating a certain story. And you see when he feels like it's starting to waver from that, or there's something he wants to add to it, he's very willing to leap in there and make a point seem to be important. Like, there are things he brings up that are in his film that he feels are important because they're in his film. That's the things like the Bob Lazar remembering the hand scanner,
right? Yep.
Which is kind of evidence that was presented in the film quite dramatically. Like he was showing that Lazar says there was this hand scanner, and Corbell makes the presentation as if this is like something no one's ever been able to verify before, and no one's ever seen anything like it before, and he's managed to finally track it down, and it's this big validation of Lazar having worked at Los Alamos or wherever. And But it turns out this is something that was commonly known. It's something that's in the movie Close Encounters, and it was in like Popular Mechanics in the early 70s or late 1960s. It's this really old technology that's he would probably have been aware of. And not only that, we know that he actually went to Los Alamos.
Right.
His name's in the phone book. So he was working as some kind of subcontractor there, and it could quite well be something that he had seen and just kind of incorporated that into his story. But my point here is that Lazar is telling a story, and a lot of people like that story. So he has an audience. You personally might not like it. I don't really like it, but a lot of people do like it, and they like the way he presents it. They love the weaponize your curiosity thing because it kind of validates their own feelings about what they are doing, and so they grasp onto things like that, and they enjoy them.
Yeah, I find it fascinating, though. I mean, I find the reason I'm not one way or the other on it is I find the intricacies of the story so fascinating because there's so much to examine that I almost find it weird that it hasn't been so, clearly debunked yet. And we'll talk about where those edges are in the story where, the things that maybe have been debunked, but they're not, they don't appear to be material enough. And, there's no definitive rock hard proof that he's, lying on this, that, or the other on like the major issues. And so he's able to kind of walk this line and toe this line around the fringes of parts of this story. But, it reminds me, just going back to the hand scanner. Right, the hand scanner was the big piece of evidence in the documentary, as far as I remember. That was the big reveal, like you said. And the claim was that this was a scanner that you put your hands on that supposedly measured the length of the bones in your fingers, and that's how it identified you and ostensibly granted or denied you access to, I believe, S4, which is where he claimed that the scanner was from. And so the big reveal was that Corbell had finally turned up this thing that Bob had claimed years ago was used, but everybody told him they didn't have the technology then, whatever. And it turns out here it is, and it's, it's from the 80s, and it actually existed, and it's a real thing. And while that is, appears to be relatively good proof that hand scanner was in fact in use somewhere, either at Los Alamos or S4. Even if he was at S4, he may have been there, but maybe he just wasn't working on flying saucers. That's all it is. That's all it is evidence that existed. And I always remember Bill Nye did this interview on CNN with a couple of guys that claimed they had spotted UFOs. And this is years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. And he's arguing with the guys. I think it was on Larry King's show, and one of the guys is saying, if it wasn't an airplane, what was it? As if that's some kind of direct evidence of being a UFO. And Bill Nye says to the guy, he says, listen, it's a huge stretch between saying you see something in the sky that you can't identify to get to it's aliens in flying saucers. And it's the same thing right here. It is a huge stretch to say just because you found that a hand scanner that was used in whatever, Los Alamos or in a government area, whatever, in the 80s, that doesn't validate a story about reverse engineering alien craft. It just validates the fact that here's this hand scanner. That's it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that people look for these elements of truth in the story, and any good fake story would have as much truth in it as possible, and you kind of bury the thing that you're making up in things that are verifiable and true.
Right.
So if someone's skeptical about the story, you can even put things in that are obscure but true, that will get verified later. So he knows that this particular thing isn't particularly well known, and he can stick it in there, and it seems like it will get verified. Or he can use fairly obscure things. Like I said, he's if he is lying, which I think he's not telling the truth. he's quite good at what he does. So either somehow he's convinced himself that this was true, or he's making it up. But either way, he's created, I think, a kind of a reality in his mind that he can refer to, and he does this in a way that it comes across as if he's telling the truth. And I think if you want to tell a lie well, you have to kind of half believe it, so you can just speak from your own belief rather than be making things up all the time.
Right. Or I think what could be the scenario here is that part of the story is true. For instance, we know he worked at Los Alamos National Lab in some respect, right? So it's way easier to make up a lie if you tell 70% truth and then you stretch it 30%, to get to 100% instead of just coming up with 100% bullshit.
Yeah. Yeah, so then the question is, did he work at S4, which is this supposed kind of underground, built into the hillside site that no one has been able to find up at Poose Lake, when, if you look at what he was doing by all the other evidence at the time, he was, I think, running a photo processing lab.
Yep.
Right down there. And he declared bankruptcy and later, and I think he that was his only occupation, but that was before. I can't remember. I get the timeline mixed up there.
Well, let's talk about what we can agree on are
Sure.
facts.
Well, that's kind of we know everything that he said, so we got to go by what do we know about him. Like, we know that where he lived in Los Alamos. We know that he was listed in the phone book of Los Alamos National Lab. We know he was referred to in newspaper stories at the time when they were talking about his rocket car as a physicist, I think.
Right. Yes.
We know a little bit about his education, but not university level education. So
Junior college.
yes,
Pierce Junior College.
right. We know that when he was asked about his education, he named people from supposedly Caltech or MIT who were actually people who were at Pierce College.
Right. One professor specifically.
Yeah, that was William Duxler, Dr. Duxler. Yeah, he called him Dr. Duxler. And so it's kind of like when you put it like a hard requirement on what do we actually know and verify, there's very, very little, because it's all stuff that he has said. And when you actually go into looking into his actual background, you just kind of find the ordinary things about ordinary people, and all the extraordinary stuff that he claims isn't actually there. And even some of the boring stuff, like which university he went to, isn't verifiable. So we can't say we know it. We can say that it would appear that he didn't go to MIT.
Right.
If you want to say what do we actually know, just based on the general standards of evidence that we would apply to most people in terms of looking at their educational history, I would say that we know he didn't go to Caltech and we know he didn't go to MIT because there are no records of it. Now, people would then say, well, obviously they've covered up the records, but this is then this kind of appeal to magic. It's like, if there's anything that doesn't match the story, you can then kind of wave your hands and say, well, that's just
right.
That's just part of the story now, so there must be an explanation for it. And I think this is something you see a lot in conspiracy theories. If something comes up that's contradicts the story in some way, then people are very willing to accept it as being part of some kind of cover-up of the actual story.
Right, without proof of the cover-up.
Yeah, exactly. And he kind of gets away with this because people have this such huge desire to believe what he is saying, and they have this preconception that they think he's telling the truth, that when this objection comes up that his education is not what he claimed it to be, then it's very, very easy for people to accept this quite outlandish claim that his educational history would have been removed from the books at Caltech and MIT.
Yeah, the education claims have always been the sticking point for me, because if he lied about his education, then it's evidence he's a liar, and then it becomes very easy to say, all right, well, what are the boldest claims he's made? If he's lied about these relatively podunk claims, like where he got his degree, if that can be proven to be bullshit, then, certainly the antimatter reactor is probably a lie as well. So when you talk about and this is what the old ufologist Stanton Friedman talked about, and this was the kind of how he shoehorned debunking Lazar. He did it from the educational claims. He started there. When you look at what happened, so he was at a forum somewhere where he was answering questions, and people asked him about MIT, they asked him about Caltech, and aside from being able to say, well, they covered my shit up, somebody said to him, can you name one of your professors? Can you name, people that went there with you? Because it's not just his records that are missing. It's anybody and everybody that went to school with him and any of his professors from any of these institutions. So, when you do a master's degree in electronic technology from Caltech and you do a master's degree in physics from MIT, there have to be people, scores of people, 6 degrees of people in every which direction that saw you out somewhere, got a burrito with you, worked on the thesis with you, saw you in the library, were in one of your classes, were one of your professors, bumped into you in the hallway. You just don't attend, 2 of these major schools for 3-4 years to work on advanced degrees, and not, even if the government wanted to come in and scrub the memories of everybody he ever bumped into there, they wouldn't be able to do it. It would be impossible, because that's how many connections and kind of points of reference you make. And I'm just, I've been out of college for almost 16 years now, okay? And I can name several of my professors from undergrad. I can name several of my professors. I can name where I used to go to eat. I could name where I used to live. I could name 100 people off the top of my head that could validate that I was there. And the idea that when he was asked to name one of his professors, and he named the guy from Pierce Junior College, which is where he was, where he has been confirmed to have gone and started a degree at junior college, really goes back to it supports the hypothesis that he is supplementing nonsense with truth, right?
Yeah, well, he's. I guess he was kind of forced to. In some ways, I suppose that you could almost say that kind of helps his argument, because he's trying to remember, and he remembers the name of somebody, and it was at the wrong college, but he should have known that if someone then followed that up, then they would have found out who this guy actually was, and then he gave another name. Of someone who no one was being able to track down from anywhere, but wasn't at MIT and wasn't at Caltech. But you say you can remember your college professors. I can't actually remember mine.
But that was when they asked him, Mick, that forum that he did where he gave that answer. That was in like the 80s or the 90s.
Right.
So he hadn't been out of university that long.
No, I've been out of university like 30 years, so it's been
You can't name one of your professors?
No. I cannot remember any of my professors, but I'm always terrible with names. So I think what it gives him is some kind of plausible, not plausible deniability, but I think understandability, in that people can accept that he might have forgotten the names of all his professors, since I've forgotten the names of all of my professors, and lots of other people would have forgotten the names of their teachers. So a sufficient number of people will be able to accept that as evidence. I think like with a lot of these kind of conspiracy theory type things, you kind of get locked in to being forced to believe things if you start going down the path of believing things. And so when you start believing everything that he is telling you, and you start believing that he got death threats and that people tried to force him to stop talking and things like that, then you can start very easily believing that they might have tried to cover up his educational background. It's kind of this slippery slope. You end up down this Lazar rabbit hole where you end up believing everything he is telling you. Because if you start doubting one thing, then you're going to start doubting other things. But then if you get to certain things where it's definitely false, then you have to start justifying those things in the context of your belief in what he's been telling you. And he kind of introduces an element of that in his story, which is a good move if you want more people to believe you. But he talks about how he thinks that they tried some kind of mind control things on him. And they tried to give him some kind of hypnotic brainwashing type situation, and gave him various mind control drugs and things. And he starts to doubt his own recollection of things, or as he claims he does, because he thinks that he went through this process. So now, if he says something and it turns out to be false, he can just say, oh, well, that was just the mind control that made me think that. So at that point, you get to be able to just pick and choose whatever you believe from everything he says. And people really want to believe the UFO stuff. They think that's amazing stuff. They want to believe that the government is hiding amazing technology from us. And they want to believe that we're on the verge of some kind of disclosure. And they want to believe that some army guy is having an alien living in his basement in some kind of force field container. These are all like great things that we want to believe. And if you have to kind of gloss over a few little things like some guy's educational background, then that's fine. And if a few of a few of his memories don't line up, then that's fine too. Maybe it was a bit of brain control and he's a little bit confused, but the big stuff is right there. But of course, there's no actual evidence of these things that we want to believe that he is saying. So on the one hand, we're picking and choosing what we want to believe, but we're doing it with the same thing. It's all just stuff that he has told us. And we know there's a bunch of stuff he's told us that's false. But there's a bunch of other stuff where we think, oh, that'd be great if that was true. But why are people believing it? They just believe it because he tells a good story and they want to believe.
Yeah, I think the strongest piece of evidence that supports his story is that he can prove, I think it's provable that he worked at Los Alamos. He brought George Knapp there, right? At one point. If you listen to the foreword of his book, George Knapp reads the foreword to his book, Dreamland, which another thing, like the documentary, I was very excited to get the book because I figured, all right, here's the down and dirty details. This is finally going to seal it for me. This is going to explain. And most notably, what I looked for was the educational background and the timeline on the education, which was the big deal. You're sitting down to prepare a book, to write your history, to write your memoirs. You have all the time in the world to at least come up with a fake story about it and get it down somewhere with a timeline that fits with all the other claims that you've made. Mick, if you and I had a year to sit down and prepare to write a book, we could come up with a pretty decent timeline of all this stuff, and we could really we could add to the discussion things that would really make the story more credible. And when I listened to the book, I didn't get any of that, but for George Knapp at the beginning talking about, hey, back in the 80s when this whole thing started, I had Bob bring me to Los Alamos National Lab. And, we went right in through the front door with cameras. The guard waved at him. He said, hi, Bob, how you doing? This is before 9/11, so there was very lax security. And he walked me around the lab and showed me the particle accelerator and all this other shit. And people there knew him. And, between that and the news article, which described him as a physicist there, I think it is likely that he worked as a physicist at Los Alamos.
Yeah, well, let me just read a paragraph from the start of that, which kind of talks to all these things. This is George Knapp from the introduction to Dreamland, which is very directly talking about what we're saying. He says, During the early stages of our investigation of Lazar's claims, the absence of school records was a major concern. If he would lie about where he went to college, might he also lie about working on flying saucers out of S4? Lazar told us that someone was erasing the paper trail of his life to that point. We decided to focus on his claim about working as a physicist at Los Alamos National Lab. If he was really employed there, and if it could be proven that he worked on sensitive or classified projects, then it was at least plausible that he would have been hired to work on another sensitive defense-related project in the Nevada desert. It would also make sense that he must have had some level of education to make it into the door of Los Alamos, given that no one is hired to work there without some sort of college degree. More importantly, it would mean he would be given a security clearance, which would have required a background check to verify his credentials. So there I think Knapp is kind of trying to kind of wrap up an argument that kind of either makes the credentials kind of given that these credentials must exist, otherwise he wouldn't have gone to work at this lab. This is the argument, which is nonsense. Yeah, the claim that he made, and I highlighted in the book when I read it, is that no one is hired to work there without some sort of college degree. I mean, does that mean the guys who work in the cafeteria have to have a college degree? Does it mean all the electricians have to have college degrees? Does it mean they have to have an MS? If you're just doing something like, I don't know, servicing the photocopiers, you don't need a college degree to do that. And not everybody who works at Los Alamos is actually a scientist or somebody involved in the actual research. He would presumably have been given some sort of security clearance, and that would have required maybe a background check to verify his credentials, but that doesn't mean he was claiming that. So he wasn't claiming he had an MS and using that to get into Los Alamos, and that would have been verified. He claimed later that he had an MS in physics. We don't know what he actually did at Los Alamos, but we know he was kind of working for this subcontractor, and not directly for the military. So I think Knapp has tried to gloss over the issue there by saying that, they must have had credentials, otherwise why would he have been working there? But that argument doesn't actually hold up. However, it's an argument that I think, like I was saying earlier, people who want to believe will just take that argument and say, oh yeah, that kind of proves it. We don't need to worry about his credentials because he was working at the lab, therefore he had the credentials.
Yeah, it's an interesting... he wraps up a couple of arguments with evidence of something completely different. That's like me saying, if I showed you I have a MD, then I must be a practicing physician somewhere that lives in a mansion and drives a Porsche. I'd be like, no, It just means you're an MD. That's it. And it's the same with Lazar, right? It means his name in the phone book there, and the fact that he was recognized there means that he worked there. It means that people there were familiar with him. It means, and again, as you said earlier, he worked there as a contractor. It would also kind of beg the question of why he was listed as a physicist in that newspaper article, but that very well could be the author of that article asking him what his title is and him saying physicist.
Indeed, yeah. So it's I mean, why else would that happen? Like when you talk to somebody as a journalist, you ask them what their occupation is. You don't go and look them up somewhere else and then write what their occupation is. You just take it as they're going to be honest with you. So almost certainly that was Lazar just saying that, I'm a physicist and I work at Los Alamos, which sounds great.
So you agree, though, he worked at Los Alamos? You think it's the evidence is there that he worked at Los Alamos, definitely?
Yeah, I think especially, the fact that he's listed in the phone book seems like a reasonable amount of evidence, and there's some other evidence of people saying that they remember seeing him there, but that's a little bit more dubious. But it's fine. He lived there in Los Alamos, in the city of Los Alamos, and it shows up in that phone book. Seems fair enough, but we don't know what he actually did there. Did he work on like high-end particle accelerators, or was he just someone who serviced photocopiers? I don't know what the various theories are. I'm just picking that one at random, but he his background, his educational background, obviously doesn't seem to indicate that he is a physicist, but he's perhaps a good technician. What he did afterwards was kind of chemistry type stuff. He ran this chemistry supply company eventually years later, so he knows about science. And he was a good tinkerer. He could make jet engines in his backyard. He was obviously a smart guy, so he has some talent and can do some things. And people work in Los Alamos for a variety of reasons, and a lot of those reasons are pretty mundane ones, like keeping the lights on.
Right. And he definitely has a rudimentary understanding of science and of physics.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. Yeah, but again, in a way, it's a superficial, but a bit better than superficial, but not very deep. When I talk to people with like PhDs in physics or master's degrees in physics, like I used to work with a guy back at Neversoft who had a physics PhD, and the stuff they talk about is incomprehensible, and it's not because I'm stupid. It's just because there's this domain of knowledge that is kind of out of the mainstream. But the stuff that he was talking about, the stuff that Lazar was talking about, was very comprehensible. It was like the type of stuff you would read in popular science, or the type of stuff that would appear in a science fiction movie like Close Encounters, or the type of stuff that was just in some kind of science fiction book. It was popular science stuff, talked about by someone with a bit of a technical background. So he could talk about, to a certain degree, how gravity acts as a wave, which it doesn't really act as a wave. It kind of propagates as a wave. It's actually a field rather than a wave. But he could talk about things in a way that sounded good and had a certain degree of technical correctness. Like you can talk about protons and antimatter and thermionic generators and gravity, and do it in a way that sounds reasonable, but it doesn't really sound like someone with an advanced degree in physics.
Right.
It sounds like someone who reads a lot of science fiction, or someone who watches a lot of science fiction movies, who's just interested in that type of thing. Like he probably could give you a good description of how his jet engine works, but not really get into the actual physics of it, the actual equations, the complicated equations that real rocket scientists would use, because what he was doing was just a popular science or popular mechanics type jet engine. It wasn't really some kind of advanced physics type of thing. And you see this over and over again with the things that he is doing is kind of science fiction level science. And so it sounds good to people who are UFO fans, because UFO fans are usually science fiction fans, and they've usually read like a bunch of stories. Like a lot of science fiction is what they call hard sci-fi, where they actually discuss the science. About, let's see, the Ringworld saga, for example, famous science fiction stuff that's got like lots of hard science in it, but not difficult to understand science. And that's what we're seeing from Lazar. Simple science.
Yeah, and if you don't have a background in science at all, everything he says sounds fantastic. Everything he says sounds like technical mumbo jumbo. It's like being a computer programmer, and you have a guy that's a computer programmer and a guy that knows nothing about computers at all, and you get somebody that just comes out and starts going, hey, random access memory, hard drives, flash drives, USB ports, and the guy that knows nothing about computers is like, holy shit, is this guy from the future? This is incredible. And somebody that's a computer programmer knows that that's all very base level, rudimentary, what the kid at Best Buy knows about before he sells you a computer.
I think most people who know a little bit of science or a little bit of any kind of technology kind of forget just how completely blind the average person is about these subjects. Especially like computer programming I know a lot about computer programming, and when you try to explain it to people, they just have no idea. You may as well be talking Greek to them. It just makes no sense whatsoever. But he doesn't even really get to that level. I think he says things in very simplistic ways, like he's saying that antimatter is being used as a fuel source, and that's just something you see in things like Star Trek or whatever. It's just like a standard staple of science fiction. There's this stuff called antimatter. You don't even need to understand what antimatter actually is. You just know that it's this stuff that's this really powerful fuel source. And then you can say antimatter is used to create energy, and then we use that to negate gravity. And people have an understanding vaguely of what gravity is. It's what pulls you down, and if you can bend gravity around, it will push you up. So people kind of have a very simplistic understanding of it, but he never really gets into the actual details of it.
People will argue that antimatter reactor is brought up, in science fiction because it is the most likely next iteration of power versus the other way around, which is what you're putting, which is, hey, he's kind of drawing from sci-fi, right? People are going to say, well, that's the next iteration. It's like element 115, right?
Yeah,
we knew that there was an element 115 before there was an element 115, yet he gets this credit for claiming that there was an element 115, right?
Yeah. And it doesn't really make any difference. Like if it's actually a plausible thing, because it's this thing that is also really, really strongly used in popular culture, of being this fuel that people use. In Star Trek they use dilithium crystals, which I think is something completely different. But then the idea of a warp drive, which is essentially what he's describing, something that warps space. That's just a staple of science fiction. It's not anything particularly amazing. It'd be amazing if it was true, but it's not like anything that would require a large amount of creativity to come up with. It's just a standard thing that exists in popular culture. And then the other things he talks about, like the descriptions of the aliens, which he claims to have read about in these briefing documents, are also standard things from popular culture. I kind of started with that little timeline that I said, and I included Close Encounters. You look at the alien in Close Encounters at the end of the movie when he comes out of the spaceship, and it's like your classic gray alien. It's actually gray, and it's got these big black eyes, tiny nose, like hidden ears, and a little slit for a mouth, and it's about 3 or 4 feet high. And this is the same type of thing that was that he described, and the same type of thing that we see in many other alien.
But then you
encounters.
have another chicken or the egg type argument there, right? Which is, did Close Encounters characterize aliens like that because somebody saw them and gave that description, and that was the de facto description, or is that the image that people that claim to have seen aliens after that drew upon?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, we know that when an idea enters popular culture, people start seeing that thing. This is just kind of a standard thing that happens. If people go out looking for things and thinking that they are seeing things, they start seeing those things. If, as is probably the case, alien abductions are almost entirely just people having dreams or nightmares or sleep paralysis type situations, like hallucinations, then they're going to see what they kind of expect to see. They're going to have dreams about aliens in the same way that you have dreams about dragons or unicorns. If you have an idea that something exists and it comes into your dream, it's going to look like the description of things that you've heard about. It's going to look like the things that you saw in the movies. So is one thing creating the other? It's I guess you could probably analyze it from a certain level of how deeply enmeshed was it in popular culture before people actually gave these descriptions. And in Bob Lazar's case, it was very, very deeply enmeshed in popular culture. This was basically him just repeating things that came from the Barney and Betty Hill abduction case in 1961. The name of the star system was the same. And of course, again, is that more evidence that it's the same star system, or is it just evidence of something being repeated through popular culture? But the latter seems more likely to me. The idea that there actually are aliens coming from Zeta Reticula, and they are abducting people in the middle of the night, and they lost 9 of their flying saucers, and let some of them their themselves be captured and held captive and entered into negotiations with the U.S. government, or are a few people just making shit up?
Right. Let's talk about the polygraph, because since we're jumping around with no basis in chronological order, people are always going to bring that up. They're going to say, well, Lazar passed a polygraph test back, I think it was in the 80s, right? In the late 80s, he took the polygraph. He was a young kid. I remember watching him. And I don't know if you've looked into that at all, have you?
Not really, but like polygraph tests, as everybody knows, are not reliable. And Lazar, as we do know, is a smart guy.
Right.
Who would have been able to look up how to fool a polygraph test.
Right, and he took several, too. He took, he either took 2 or 3. I don't remember. He took multiple polygraph tests. Here it is. This isn't it. But he did take multiple polygraph tests, and one of them, I think, came back inconclusive, and I think the other one came back a pass. And that would be indicative of somebody, trying to fool a polygraph. And if you don't know about that, you can listen. I did a podcast with this guy, Doug Williams, who is out there. He's got a major beef with polygraph examiners and polygraph tests. He used to be a polygraph examiner, I think, for police department. I can't remember his story, but it was an awesome podcast because he just runs through the entire kit and caboodle about why they are completely unreliable and how ridiculous the questionings are, the line of questionings and the intimidation tactics that are used, and how quite easy they are to fool if you know how to fool them. And so if I see somebody that's taken multiple tests and one of them has come back inconclusive, which essentially means that the examiner can't get a control and can't get a way to judge accurate answers based on that control. Either the control is skewed or the answers are skewed, and another one comes back a pass. That certainly could be indicative of somebody trying to manipulate the exam, right?
Yeah. Well, polygraph tests really aren't used as a way of determining truth. That's kind of like how they're presented, but they're generally not admissible as like absolute evidence in court. And they're used more as a kind of an interrogation technique, as a way of revealing evidence and leads that can be followed up. But people like to think of them as being these things that mean something. Like if someone agrees to take a polygraph test and then passes or fails, you think it actually means something. I remember back when I was debunking chemtrails like 10 years ago, a guy who thought I was being paid for by the CIA said like I should take a polygraph test, and he said he would actually pay for me to take it, and I foolishly agreed to do this at first because I thought I'll just take a polygraph test, that'll be interesting, see what happens. Then I thought, what happens if I fail this polygraph test, or if it comes back inconclusive?
People are going to
because that might happen. Because I'd imagine you go into these polygraph things and you're all nervous and you don't know what's going on, and I would obviously want to go in there and just tell the truth. I'm not paid for. The CIA does not pay me anything, but you could see it going wrong. You could see it actually giving you the actual false result, and so I then declined to take the test, and of course that's
evidence of you
was
working
absolute
for the
proof that I was in fact paid for by the CIA. So that's nothing ever came of it really. But it's not really very definitive when that happens, and I really wouldn't read anything to it one way or the other, because there's so many variables, and you don't really know what's the quality of the polygraph examiner, and how good is this person at lying, and perhaps he's the type of person who believes his own lies. He's been saying the same story for such a long time. Perhaps if you keep telling the story for years, then it doesn't feel like lying, and your body doesn't react when you tell the story again. You're just telling a story.
Yeah. George Costanza, it's not a lie if you believe it.
Yeah.
But, going forward from Los Alamos, then there's S4, right? So let's talk about what, if anything, we can confirm about him being at S4. And, the story goes that once he's out there and he's interviewed and he fills out his paperwork, that he could be at home on a random day at his house in Las Vegas and the phone would ring and they would say to him over the phone, "Bob, it's now 11:30. We expect you to be at McCarran Airport at 12 o'clock." And then they would hang up. And his job as somebody that worked at S4, Area 51, was to then drop whatever he was doing, like Batman, like you got a phone, you got a call on the bat signal. And he would have to drop whatever he was doing, get to Las Vegas Airport, hop on the Janet flights, which are, very well-known flights that do, in fact, have their own terminal at the airport and run back and forth. Their government flights that run back and forth, I guess, ostensibly to Area 51. And that he would get out there and he would land, and then he would take a bus with blacked-out windows, and then he would wind up, going into S4, and that's where he worked. And right from the get-go, when I heard that story, I'm like, that sounds kind of stupid. I mean, it just does. It sounds like if you were making up a story, that's what you would say. Like, well, I would just receive mysterious phone calls, and I would have to just drop what I was doing. And what he claimed to be doing there, which was essentially that, that the government had these flying saucers there, and his job was to figure out how they worked, basically. And they had them for decades. That is a very, I don't know, it just doesn't come off like something where you would need to drop everything and go there at midnight. I mean, I feel like you would just work on that 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, right?
And I think like the story doesn't really make any sense. And I think one of the key things about why it doesn't make sense is why would they hire him to do this? What qualifications did he actually have? And he actually, in an interview I was listening to yesterday, he kind of admits that's a bit bemusing as well. And he kind of describes this kind of interview process he went through and says they were asking him about his hobby type experimentation, like his little hobby jet engine that he was building. And it doesn't really seem to make any sense that they would actually need a person like him, because he doesn't really seem to have any skills that would translate to flying saucers that use some kind of space warp technology and anti-gravity, antimatter. They don't use jet engines. So his experience with making a jet engine and strapping it to a car or a bicycle isn't really relevant. And what he claims to have been doing before is in Los Alamos is a bit vague, and he hadn't been doing it for 6 years, I think. Like he actually left Los Alamos,
right?
Like in the early 80s, and was running a business as a photography developer, developing people's photographs, a photo lab. So they're going to take a guy who makes jet engines, who runs a photo lab, and they have him come in and analyze flying saucers. It doesn't really make any sense. It doesn't really add up.
Yeah, I guess the link there is, or the perceived link maybe that they're trying to make is propulsion, right? Hey, I worked on this jet engine that I strapped to my car at some point. Yeah. And now,
you don't even make that link.
What he had said, I think what he had said in previous interviews was that they were looking for kind of a cowboy. They were looking for a wild card when it came to propulsion, because they got these fucking crafts and they got no clue how they work, and they're getting from point A to point B. So they just brought me in as the wild card.
I mean that's I think that makes sense if you know nothing about propulsion. But these are two radically different methods of locomotion that have no connection whatsoever to each other. One is warping the very fabric of time and space itself, and the other is just like burning propane and shooting it out the back of a big tube. It's completely an irrelevant connection. Like, it kind of perhaps sounds like there might be something, but there really isn't. You want someone who's into, I don't know, the more esoteric fields, like the actual physics behind gravity fields and whatnot. But just a jet engine is nothing.
Right.
And There's no reason why that would have been something that he would have been good at doing. And what did he actually do at S4? What are the actual tests that he did? What was the actual physics that he worked on? You know, he gives these stories about things that he did, but they're just banal little fun little stories about how he turned on the thing and threw a golf ball at it and it bounced off the ceiling. There's really nothing about the actual science.
Yeah, no, they're all little anecdotal kind of stories, like you said. Like, oh, he walked through it, and everything was made out of the same material, and he even peeked his head down into the bottom level to get a look at the gravity warp, whatever the hell the things are called, And so he's got all these little anecdotal stories, like you said, about the golf ball, right? Hey, all right, the reactor was shaped like half a basketball, and I threw a golf ball at it, and it bounced right off. It was crazy. Mm-hmm. And I said to Barry, my work partner, that's crazy. And he said, that's crazy too. And it's like, all right, well, what did you do for the other 7 hours of that work shift that you were there, right? Like, what were you writing down? What notebooks did you use? What computer system did you use? What data were you logging? And there's none of that. And I think he only claims to have worked there for a couple of months. But he would be, ostensibly would be able to recall a significant amount of that, right?
Yeah, I mean, what actual tests were being done? I mean, throwing a golf ball at it. I mean, why the fuck would you throw a golf ball at it? It's like you've got the most amazing thing in human history right there in your lab, and you're like, what are you doing? Hitting it with a hammer and throwing golf balls at it?
Right.
This is the science that they're doing? No, you would be having that 500 feet away and measuring it with some kind of remote instruments at first, and then gradually getting closer and doing little things, and then trying to perturb it very, very slightly and making all these vast amounts of measurements of the changes in the field.
Right.
You wouldn't be throwing golf balls at it.
Right. Exactly. and his whole recollections of S4 are littered with a lot of these anecdotal little, I don't even know what you call them. They're like little they're just like little nuggets that people can kind of sink their teeth into. Like when he says, the craft, that they had put a U.S. flag decal on the sport model craft, which was supposedly the craft he was working on. Or, he saw the poster of the sport model craft on the wall that said, "We're here" underneath it. Okay. But there's a lot of these little anecdotes, but there isn't really any detail. It's just like the educational background, right? We have a 50,000 foot bird's eye view, but we don't really have anything else.
It's a story. He's telling a story, and it's like telling a science fiction level story about what's happened. If someone was to write a popular book, which essentially is what he did with his writing Dreamland, it's just that simplistic, understandable story. But he wanted people to believe him. I guess that's the other thing. He claims he doesn't want people to believe him because it would be more convenient if they don't believe him, which is kind of a get out of jail free card. It means that he can just be like, oh yeah, I don't really want to bother telling my story in sufficient detail that people will believe me, even though he wrote a whole book about it. He should be able to explain some of the science behind what went on, beyond these simplistic popular mechanics type explanations. His explanation of how it works is so ludicrously simple and nonsensical that it just reads like bad science fiction, really. Like he's saying that there's this element 115 that you bombard with protons and it creates antimatter, and that antimatter creates heat, and then there's 100% efficient thermionic generator that takes that heat and converts it 100% into electricity, and then that electricity somehow generates gravity because there's so much electricity it makes gravity, and then there's these gravity waveguides that shape the gravity into this kind of heart-shaped toroidal thing around the craft, and that warps space sufficiently so that the craft moves and flies around. I mean, it's just like it's something he's read in a comic.
Well, and there's just no evidence.
Yeah.
There's literally no evidence other than very circumstantial fringe stuff like the hand scanner And, he has he was able, I think, to produce a pay stub from the United States Navy. I don't know did you ever see that?
Yes, in fact, I was looking at it. It's right in front of me. Yeah, it's got like this number that he has on his like E6722 MAJ.
Right.
MAJ is like Majestic 12, I guess, which is the Majestic security clearance.
Well, what do you make of that?
Well, I mean, it could be fake. I mean, all it is a standard W-2 form with stuff typed on it.
Right.
And that's all it is. So what is there to indicate that it's not fake?
I don't know.
There's nothing. I mean, does he have his tax returns that also include this thing? Yeah. It's and I don't know. If he actually got this whatever it was, $958 from the United States Department of Naval Intelligence, does it mean anything? But my first bet here, I like to list my hypotheses in order of likelihood, and I think the most likely thing here is that this is just simply a fake thing that somebody has typed up, probably him, because there's nothing at all official on it. All it is a piece of paper, which could have been photocopied, and some typewritten letters.
Yeah, either that or he did receive a W-2 for $958, which is not a very material amount of money, first off. I mean, It certainly doesn't seem to me commensurate with the type of money a scientist would make that is working on the forefront of technology as we know it. But, or it could be, that he was working as a janitor for the I think it says United States Naval Intelligence or something. What's the actual listed employer on there?
United States Department of Naval Intelligence, Washington, D.C.
Right. And so that could be anything. It could be from anything. But, it's not proof that he didn't work there, and it's not proof that he did work there. It doesn't say S4. It's not signed by the president. It's, go ahead.
You've got to think, if he's making all these claims that he worked there, then either he's lying or he did work there. So he's either lying or telling the truth, one of those two things. So if he did work there, then this is evidence that supports that. If he did not, it is not. It's just another lie. So it's really no different from his verbal lies. It's just a written down lie. So the fact that he comes up with a document that supports him doesn't actually add anything, because there's no way of verifying this document and it came from him. So there's no it seems superficially like it's a good thing for his case, but it's no different to a verbal lie. It's just a written down lie.
So what do you make of him being able to conceptualize element 115 before it had been technically discovered?
Yeah, well, this is like, the famous thing, but element 115 at the time was no one had ever managed to synthesize element 115. And, just very simply with the science, the periodic table of elements lists the elements, and they all have a number, and it starts with the simplest number 1, which is hydrogen, and number 2, which is helium, and then it goes on from there, and they get more complicated. And the elements towards the start were things that were around at the start of the universe, and the elements toward the end are older things that form when stars collapse and things like that. And we've discovered a bunch of them, and some of them occur naturally, and some of them we have to make because they don't occur naturally, at least on Earth. And there were gaps in the table, and there were spaces at the end where they thought there were going to be elements. And we were just gradually discovering these elements. Like every year or so, we discover a new one. Like I think originally when they did the table, it only went up to like 99 or something. So and they started discovering these ones later and later. So we knew we were going to discover elements. And there was an article, I believe, in Scientific American, I think the year before he started talking about it, which described element 115 as being a potential candidate for a stable element. And there was really, if he wanted to come up with an exotic element that could be used as a fuel, it just seemed like a good pick. 115. He might have picked 114 or 116, but he picked 115. It didn't really make any difference either way, and it wasn't at all surprising that it was then discovered later on. And it wasn't discovered in the way he described it, of course. He described it as being a stable element that you could actually, kind of move around. But the 115 that we've synthesized up till now has been unstable, and it's not clear if it can actually be stable. So he didn't really predict anything that wasn't already existing in popular science and probably in science fiction, but certainly in popular science.
Yeah, and if you remember, 2001, I graduated high school, so I remember being in chemistry class, and I was in remedial chemistry, but I was in chemistry class nonetheless in 98, 99, 2000, and I remember seeing unum Pentium on the periodic table, which was one of the placeholders for 115 prior to us synthesizing it, I think in 2003 when they synthesized it for the first time officially. It doesn't explain, it doesn't really explain why he said that, but it adds to your case that, we kind of knew these things were out there. It was just a matter of time until we officially synthesized them or officially were able to. It's like, how did we know that the Higgs boson was out there, right? And we had this spot for it in the standard model, and then we just plugged it in once we found it. It was through deductive reasoning became clear that it was there. And so, but what's interesting is you're saying there was an article prior to him even bringing it up that suggested it existed.
Yeah. It was, I'm looking at it now. It's Scientific American in May 1989. And he didn't start talking about this stuff until actually around that time, May 1989.
Interesting.
When his first interviews with George Knapp were.
What's the date on the Scientific American article?
It says May 1989, volume 260, issue 5.
All right. So, but actually, they always put so it theoretically could have came out in April, right? Don't they?
It would have come out before May, I think.
Right.
So it would have come out in March.
And Lazar's first interview was May 15th, 1989. So how about that? Right. So Scientific American publishes in April about element 115, and 30 to 45 days later, Lazar gives his first interview and he brings up element 115.
Yeah. It's an article. It's like a variety of ways of synthesizing elements in that region. So it was sort of right there.
Yeah, that's certainly interesting.
If you look at there's various pictures of Bob Lazar, and in one picture he has a periodic table of elements in his background, and you can see there it's an older periodic table, and there's a space where element 115 would be, and a few others. I think it only goes up to like 112 or something on his thing. But you can see on this periodic table of elements that's behind him in his shop, there's a little note that's printed on the actual thing, which probably says something like, this region has is where elements 111 through 118 would be.
Yeah, I remember reading that in textbooks back in the day.
Yeah, because people knew that the periodic table of elements isn't just like a pretty way of arranging things. It's arranged in a way that relates to the physical structure of the protons and the neutrons and the electron shells. And we know that there are areas where there are more likely going to be more things discovered, just because it's an extension of the elements. Just by having more elemental particles, protons and neutrons, gets you new elements. So it's not a complicated thing.
Yeah, very interesting. And so then from there, again, he claims to start back engineering this craft at S4. And one of the interesting parts of the story I always thought was he claimed that that at one point the bay doors were open and he could see all 9 craft. Did you ever hear that claim?
I did, yeah. So someone brought it up on my site actually a while ago, and we were doing an analysis of what that would actually look like. But
did you ever see him draw it? Did you ever see the lecture he gave where he drew on a whiteboard exactly how the doors opened between the bay areas?
I did. I was actually went to look at that video, and it got taken down. I think it was him. It was at I can't remember what it was, like 90-something UFO conference that he was at, and he was standing up describing this. But yeah, it was like there was this just long line of hangars, and each one had a different flying saucer in, and there were these doors connecting the hangars, and they were all open, so you could see all the flying saucers at the same time. Yeah,
but that never made sense to me, the way that he drew it. The way that he drew it was, in essence, if you imagine walking into a garage from say you're walking into a garage from the back of a garage and you're facing out, the front of a house. So the garage door, the garage door is in front of you, and you're standing in the back of a garage facing forward at the garage door, right? Ostensibly, that would be the bay door on the side of the mountain, we'll say, right? And if you look to your right on that garage door wall, what he drew was a picture of a door that looks like a normal door, like you would walk through in any normal building, or perhaps like you probably already have in your garage now that leads into the house, right? And what I believe he claimed in that video was that all of those doors going 9 garages down were open. So in essence, you had a normal-sized human door open, and that there were 9 other doors open all the way down, so you could see all the way through the backs of all the other garages, essentially. If you were in the back of the garage, you were looking right down the whole line of garages. That would not give you the visibility to identify one, let alone all 9 of the crafts in there.
I have to kind of disagree with you there, because this is something I remember we did actually look at on Metabunk, and we did kind of a recreation of it. And there's a thread which is called "Debunking Bob Lazar's Drawing of S4 Hangars," which was a while ago, back in 2018. I think this was actually one of the first times that I really heard about Bob Lazar. I wasn't really familiar with him at all before this thing came up. But if the doors are lined up, then you would be able to actually see something of what's in each.
Yeah, but you wouldn't be able to identify all 9 of them, which is what he claims he does.
You wouldn't be able to see very much, but you can, if you you'd be able to see like the end of each one. It's like if you imagine a car in each one, you'd be able to see like the hood and the headlights and the front bumper.
That's not necessarily true, though. That's not necessarily true. I mean, think about the shape of a flying saucer, right? Ostensibly, a flying saucer gets wider the further up from the ground you get. So it's possible that
you wouldn't be able to see the entire thing.
Right. And in one of these hangars, here's the picture right here. Okay, so it's on Metabunk, and the thread is called, if you want to look it up, it's called Debunking Bob Lazar's Drawing of S4 Hangars, and it's on metabunk.org. So if you Google Metabunk, METABUNK, metabunk.org, and then Google that, it comes right up. So if you look in this drawing, and he even claims, one of the other spacecrafts looks like a Jello mold. One of the other crafts was flat and laying sideways up against the wall, and had something had been blown through it, or it had been shot down, and it looked as though something had been shot down. Okay, I'll give you 1 or 2 iterations down, but you're not going to be able to see, identify, and I mean, there is no way you could look 9 doors down and confirm that what you're looking at, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 doors down, is a craft, is anything, or that anything's going on.
It's a shame the video has been deleted. You can see it's been deleted in the thread there. But if you look at the image...
but you got the screenshot, right?
The screenshot that's right there, it just shows him he's drawing like 4 of the hangars. But you can tell, the way he's drawing it is kind of like from this God's eye view. Like he's drawing it as if he can see everything from above, like it's all open. It's like a big model that is looking down on. So it's kind of interesting that, because it kind of suggests that he's just imagining this layout in his mind,
right,
and not imagining what it would look like through these doors. So he's imagined these 9 hangars in a row with these 9 different flying saucers in it. So obviously he knows what they all look like in his head.
Right.
And then he claims he can see them.
Now you have to go back and listen to the claims that he's made about being able to identify the craft in each of these hangars, because he says he can see them. That's how he knows that there were 9. He didn't say there's 9 hangars. He said there were 9 crafts. And you and I both know that if you walked in and looked to the right and looked through 9 normal-sized doors, at ostensibly the way he draws it here, they're at the back of the hangar on each hangar. You absolutely cannot, no matter what angle you try to cut, you cannot make out what's going on. I would probably say maybe past the 3rd door, I would say. But there's no way. I mean, you may not even be able to make the 3rd one. There's no way 3 through 9 clearly come through.
Well, if you scroll down, though, there's actually a different set of drawings that he apparently did. And fax to someone. Go down to just the second post. So
look, you've already gone into this, have you?
Yeah. So he in these images, it's not just like the little garage door, like side garage door in each one. There is one side garage door in the first hangar. Then between each subsequent hangars, he's drawn a larger sliding door.
Right.
So that would make more sense, because then you'd be able to see a lot more of the craft. But then the question is, did he come up with these larger doors later, or is this something he came up with earlier?
Did he draw this photo here in the thread where you've kind of put the red line over his line of sight?
Yeah,
did he draw
I did that red line. So this someone else posted it and said that it was supposedly drawn by Lazar, and there's an annotation that says, following are a few sketches Bob faxed over the years to JFI. I'm not sure who JFI is, in order to help illustrate the hardware and events of Sector 4 on the Ellis Air Force Range. So,
but I mean, the first video is showing him drawing doors. It's not showing those sliding doors. Yeah.
So if that's what he remembers, then obviously it's incorrect.
Right.
Because he couldn't have seen those things, and the fact that he's describing them so accurately makes it seem like he's just making it up, and he's just kind of imagining the whole layout in his head.
And even if you look through this line of sight on the second drawing that you've drawn, so again, the thread is on Metabunk, which is Mick's website, and it's called Debunking Bob Lazar's Drawing of S4 Hangars. Even if you look through the second set here, first off, if he did drew this, he drew 4 identical crafts, which I'm not sure you would do if you didn't see 4 identical crafts. That's number one. That stands at odds with this story. Number 2 is, even if the other hangars did have these big sliding doors between them, you're still not going to be able to see 9 down. You may be able to see 4, but it's gonna be like looking down a row of cars parked in a parking lot. If you look down a row of cars parked in a parking lot, you can't tell what every single car is, because they're all blocking each other's line of sight.
Yeah, and he spent quite a lot of time in putting a lot of detail into this this diagram. Like, he even drew the 3 individual stalls in the bathroom, and yet he just put 2 circles for each flying saucer.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
So it doesn't add up.
But what really doesn't add up is, so this is the George Knapp interview at the UFO conference in 2015, where Bob Lazar is physically at a whiteboard drawing the doors that we talked about. And this photo very clearly shows normal human size walk-through doors, which is interesting because that actually contrasts with the second diagram, which shows that these doors are on the backside of the hangar, which he may just be omitting for the purposes of this. But yeah, his drawing, him standing here at the whiteboard, stands at very stark odds with his claims, I think.
It's also interesting in the first thing. I mean, we're talking about drawings here, which probably isn't that good for your podcast audience, but the first drawing he does shows the roof sloping down from one side to the other.
Right.
Which makes no sense whatsoever. Now, that, I think, comes from earlier drawings that he or someone else did of the doors of the supposed S4 hangars, which are shown as being sloping doors that kind of sit in the hillside.
Right.
But when you take that slope, you don't make the entire interior of the hangar be this like 30-degree slope down to nothing at one side. Because that flying saucer that he has in there would probably be banging against,
be sticking out, right?
The roof. Yeah. So, and especially if they are actually of the size that he drew in the second diagram, so it makes no sense. It's as if he's doing this kind of God's eye view of elements of his story, rather than an accurate recreation from memory.
Yeah, and I put a link to metabunk.org and that thread in the podcast description, so you can go right into the podcast description and click right through to the thread to understand what we were just talking about there for the last couple of minutes. But yeah, I mean, that's something that I had never even explored really, but for thinking it couldn't happen, and now seeing this thread, I'm thinking it really couldn't happen. But
yeah, well, I kind of thought it kind of could, but like now when you talk about it like that with the especially the first diagram, makes no sense whatsoever.
Well, in the second one, they both show kind of very. They show the front of the bays all in line, which might be the case, but if it was built into the side of a mountain, you might think that it might not be that way.
It's also very, very centered around him as well, isn't it? He's got this primo lab, like right next to all these flying saucers.
Right. Yeah.
And there's what else is going on there? He's the one guy right next to everything.
And a 3-stall bathroom.
Yeah, specifically. And some other stuff. I can't see what the other stuff is in the diagram, but
what do you make of his claims, when he starts talking about the other people that he worked with there? He always brings up this name, Dennis Mariani, who was supposedly his boss, which I always thought was interesting because he originally had identified himself as Dennis in his first anonymous interview with George Knapp. So the Dennis name comes back up, and he says, I was just using the name of my boss because I was scared. But he always uses Dennis Mariani's full name, which to me sounds like he's saying his full name to say it for credibility purposes. My boss's name, Dennis Mariani. It was always me and Dennis Mariani. Kind of this military-looking guy, Dennis Mariani. He always says his full name. But Barry, his lab partner that he worked with, I don't think has a last name. And anytime Rogan or anybody else asks him about, hey, did you ever ask about this? Like, how the fuck did you find this stuff from Zeta Reticuli? Oh, we didn't ask questions. The only person I was allowed to talk to was Barry, my lab partner. And that was it. The way that Lazar describes it, he was completely sequestered there, right? And everybody else had their own team, and they were all working on different aspects of, these different crafts. But they weren't allowed to collaborate, and they weren't allowed to share evidence. They weren't allowed to share things. I guess they all had to kind of give whatever they found up to the higher level, and then they would kind of make sense of it up there. But what did you think about his claims about the names, his boss, his lab partner? Did you ever look into that?
No, but I think again, like the way you just describe it there does really resonate with the idea of making up a story and then sticking with the story, because it seems like the repetition of the name is something that when you read a book, they always describe people in a certain way, and then that's how you think of them. But that isn't really like the real life thing. You wouldn't be calling somebody Dennis Mariani every second of the day. You would just call him Dennis.
Right.
There's no need to use his full name. It's not like there was 10 Dennises there. And the same way he refers to him as Barry. So I think that's kind of another clue, really. And in fact, we can't find this guy, and you can't ask him about it. It's just a piece of a claim that he made. So it doesn't really...
There was supposedly one guy that Knapp was able to verify, right? That somebody came to his house, I guess, and interviewed him or was vetting him for one job or the other. And I forget his name, but Knapp talks about it in the book. I think in the forward to the book, Mike something or other, and they tracked him down. You know who I'm talking about or no?
No, I don't.
No, yeah, it was another claim that was... may actually very well be true, but may not have anything to do with proving that he worked on flying saucers from another galaxy. But I think Knapp was able to find somebody who at some point had visited Lazar for one reason or the other and found out that, he was a former former government worker or something like that. But I mean, that's exactly the kind of thing that you would throw out there if you wanted to make a story. And make no doubt about it, I mean, Lazar is very intelligent. And if he is lying about some of this stuff or all of it, I suspect it's some of it. I think he's coy enough to do it in a way that would lead. He just has this very agreeable, kind of docile way about him that, when people think about liars, they think about charlatans. They think about, snake oil salesmen. They think about greasy guys and selling you used cars. They don't think about people talking very deadpan and, I don't really care if you believe me or not. It's actually quite a brilliant ruse. It is. Right? It's exactly how you would want to if you wanted to kind of make up a lie and you wanted to go meta about it. Like, it's exactly how you'd want to do it, right?
Yeah, and I think you really got to kind of look at that in the context of the other people in the story. There's John Lear. John Lear, who is the guy who introduced Lazar to Knapp, is a crazy guy. And I think even Lazar would describe him as such. He gives these ridiculous explanations of how the world works and how aliens have been in contact with the government, and he's a 9/11 truth guy who thinks that they couldn't have flown into the World Trade Center the way they did. He thinks that was all a conspiracy, and he's just got this endless stream of outrageous conspiracy theories that come across as being, to most people, being quite ridiculous. Then you've got William Cooper. William Cooper was even more extreme type of person. Bill Cooper, he was an old conspiracy theorist who was into UFOs, was kind of his first thing. But then he kind of got into more kind of anti-government militia stuff. And he was talking about a whole bunch of crazy stuff. And he obviously was a 9/11 conspiracy theorist as well. And these were both people that George Knapp had interviewed at one point or another. And George Knapp even says that he regrets interviewing Bill Cooper, because Bill Cooper was later shown to have just been making up a bunch of the stuff he was saying about UFOs. Like, he was taking other people's work and passing it off as something he discovered. And I think at one point he got tricked into repeating something that somebody had made up as a hoax sighting or a hoax paper or something. And he repeated it, and that proved that he was lying. So, you've got this William Cooper, crazy conspiracy theorist, didn't come across very well. You've got John Lear, who's slightly less crazy, but still crazy, didn't come across very well. And then you have Bob Lazar, who does a much better job. So all these three guys are people who have been interviewed by Knapp. And Knapp eventually hits upon Bob Lazar, and it's kind of like a gold mine, because Lazar's story manages to remain self-consistent, and Lazar has this quiet, self-deprecating way about himself that lends credence to his story and has enough of connection with reality that it seems quite plausible. You can easily get sucked into it. And so Knapp does these articles about Lazar, and they go viral. And so he does more, and it just became this big machine of Knapp and Lazar pumping out this stuff for the rest of the world. But it's almost like he had tried to do it before by interviewing Lear and Cooper, but it didn't work because they weren't as slick as Lazar. They were too outrageous. They had crazy conspiracy theories. But he hit upon the right guy with Lazar and just kept on it, and it worked out for both of them.
Yeah, and it's definitely career defining for George Knapp. And I actually, like we said earlier, I really liked George Knapp. I enjoyed listening to his podcast with Rogan that he did. He's got a great radio voice, so I love listening to that. Like, I used to listen to Art Bell a lot at night, going to bed. It was crazy. You always have crazy dreams about aliens and all kinds of weird shit after that. But it was always cool, to kind of let your mind wander and explore late at night, to Art Bell. And George Knapp has that same kind of affect to him.
Yeah, I actually exchanged quite a few emails with George Knapp before I knew who Bob Lazar was and before I even knew who George Knapp was.
Oh, is that right?
I just thought he was a newsman, a reporter from a local Las Vegas TV channel, which essentially is what he was. But he had emailed me about chemtrails. There was some kind of chemtrail theory, and actually I see in my email thing that I had a Skype conversation with him at some point, which something I did a lot, like I still do. Obviously, it's like talk to journalists about various things, but I have no recollection of what we actually talked about.
Mind control. Maybe you got zapped. The CIA got to you.
It wouldn't have been. It would have been chemtrails. We would have talked about the chemtrail conspiracy theory. But I was interviewed quite a lot by various journalists back then. But yeah, I talked to Bob. I talked to George Knapp. I also talked to Jeremy Corbell for a while before finding out who he was, and before I found out who Lazar was. Corbell had posted something on YouTube about a UFO sighting that he had and some other people had in Santa Monica. There were these kind of fiery things like flying around in the sky, and I tracked down, with other people on Debunk from his video. It was just these skydivers who do these pyrotechnic skydiving. They have flares attached to their ankles and they whiz around in their parachutes, and it looks quite spectacular. And Jeremy Corbell, after that, became my friend, and he kept calling me his friend, and I had no idea why he was doing this. And I think years passed, and I'd forgotten about this thing, and then we started arguing about something, probably Lazar or something like that, or the Fravor or something, and Corbell's like, Mick, I always considered you to be my friend, and I'm like, what? Who are you? I couldn't remember talking to him originally, and then he mentioned something about the skydivers, and I went back and figured it out. But yeah, these strange connections. I talked to the people involved here without realizing who they were. Of course, I never talked to Lazar, which would be an interesting conversation.
Well, and nobody of any type of scientific prowess has talked to Lazar. I mean, wouldn't you want to sit him up there with a physicist and just let somebody who's a physicist do?
Exactly.
Where is the world's foremost expert in warp drives, and why is he not asking Bob Lazar questions? Can he stand an hour with that guy, or
exactly.
Or is he just going to do conversations with George Knapp?
I mean, we keep making the same points here that Lazar is just putting this cartoon version of physics out there, when supposedly he's the guy who was reverse engineering the physics. So why don't you hit us with a bit of physics, and not just we use antimatter and it creates. How does it do these things, and what, or not even how does it do it? What were the measurements you made? Show me what did the graphs look like? What units did you use? What instruments did you use to measure things? Beyond throwing golf balls at it, what actual tests did you perform?
Well, you'd have to be able to just withstand a 30 or 45 minute just battery of questions, just regular questions that a normal physicist would ask you over a beer. They don't even have to come prepared. We could just go grab a physicist off the street and be like, hey, all right,
we should just find somebody who has a master's degree in physics and a master's degree in electronics. I'm sure that such a person exists somewhere.
Well, that was the other thing, too, about that Caltech degree, the electronic technology degree. I don't even think they offered electronic technology as a study. I think they offered something like electronics or something, but whatever he first claimed to have his degree in wasn't even a program there. So that was, obviously another red flag there with the education. But yeah, I mean, look, I would host that any day of the week. So if Bob wanted to come on and he wanted to, just speak to a physicist, we could go and we'd promise to select somebody who isn't even at the PhD level. We'll find you somebody with a master's in physics from a non-Ivy League university. All right, that's what we could promise. We'll find somebody from a public university with a master's in physics, just to square up for 30 to 45 minutes and just have a conversation about exactly what you're talking about. What are the weights and the measurements that you used? What tools did you use? There's so many little questions in between all of these very broad stroke details. I want to go to Jeremy Corbell for a second, because this speaks to kind of a broader question that I had for you that I wanted to ask as we're heading into the back end of this conversation. Look, Jeremy Corbell's a black belt in jiu-jitsu. He earns a certain degree of respect from me, regardless of whatever the hell else he does in his life, just because of that. It's one of the hardest possible things a human being can do, so I respect that immensely. Having said that, there hasn't been anything that Jeremy Corbell has added to any conversation that I've seen him in that really, to me, comes off as adding anything. As far as I'm concerned, the Lazar interview and the George Knapp interview could have been done without him sitting there.
Yeah, and the Fravor interview too.
Oh, yeah, the Fravor interview. That's what I wanted to ask you about. Because the last time you were on, we talked about, the reason I wanted to have you on is because you had debunked the Nimitz video, and I thought you did a fucking really good job. I thought your explanations were plausible. I thought they made sense. I thought you did a beautiful job on your YouTube channel of explaining exactly what was going on with the, and then Corbell comes out with this theory that your assertion that, the object may have been a bird is insane because, the temperature of the water is different than the temperature of the bird, which then you debunked his analysis of
I know, I debunked it when it wasn't even something I was claiming in the first place, but...
And then, so then with this Knapp interview, Mick, Corbell takes this, victory lap on that. Like he shut Mick West down.
Did he? Oh.
Yeah, you didn't see that?
No.
Oh, so you got to watch the George Knapp interview with Rogan, because they talk about you and they talk about that little back and forth that you guys had about the Nimitz video. And Corbell has this very matter-of-fact, dealt with Mick West. That's over. He's an idiot,
ridiculous. It was so ridiculous because I can't remember, did we talk about this last time, but the whole cold bird thing. It's one of the videos, not even the Fravor video. I'm not even talking about the Fravor video. It's just one of the other videos. The Go Fast video shows an object that's cold and moving fairly slow. And there's two things that are cold and move fairly slow, which is balloons and well-insulated birds. And that was all the point was. But I think it was almost like a year after I suggested perhaps it was a bird, he comes out with this thing where he seems like he spent months working on this, analyzing the science, and discovered that if a bird was really cold, it would be dead. Which makes no sense, because it essentially is positing a naked bird, a bird with no feathers, because what he's talking about is the core temperature of the bird, and what I'm talking about is the temperature on the exterior of the feathers, which is like the temperature on the exterior of an insulated jacket. It's the same as the air around it, or maybe it's slightly warmer, but certainly a lot colder than the sea level. But I don't even think the bird hypothesis, it was my main hypothesis. The main thing is that it's probably a balloon. And he doesn't even talk about that. So it's like he's got one thing that sounds good. It's like, Mick West, in his stupid cold bird theory. But his objection to my cold bird theory is completely bogus. It makes no sense in a scientific way whatsoever. And it's not even my number one theory. He ignores the number one theory, which is probably because he can't debunk that one. But yeah, Corbell, I'm sure he's a nice guy to have a beer with, but he just likes to tell stories, and he doesn't like his stories being shat upon. And so he pushes back with a different story, which also sounds good. But it's not doing any science. He's not revealing amazing things. He's not. He doesn't even seem to really understand the objections that I raise. Either he doesn't understand them, or he's ignoring them because he knows they make too much sense. So yeah, I don't have that much respect for him.
I think he's a nice guy. I'm sure he's a nice guy, and I think he wants to believe. I don't think it's I don't think he's like an ultra nefarious person. I think he really wants to believe. And I think there are a lot I think it's
just that, though. I think
Go ahead.
No, I think there's more than that. He wants to believe, but he also wants people to believe him. He wants to be seen as this guy who weaponized his curiosity and discovered all this stuff and revealed it to the world. So it's not just he's saying what he thinks is true. He's saying what he wants everybody else to think is true.
There's this great moment in the George Knapp, Joe Rogan podcast. I'm going to find the number right now while I'm on. It's one of the few remaining podcasts that Rogan left on YouTube. It's Joe Rogan Experience number 1510, George Knapp and Jeremy Corbell. There's this great moment in that one, because I've watched this one probably 25 or 30 times too, just because I like George Knapp's voice. But there's this great moment too where they're talking about, mutilated cattle, right? They're talking about mutilated animals out in the field, and it was crazy. There was no blood, Mick. They found the corpse and there was no blood, and there was an incision. And how does that happen? How does it happen that there's no blood? How does it happen that animals just wind up mutilated? Well, it's like, well, first off, that happens in nature, first and foremost, right? If it wasn't something that naturally occurred in nature, there's 10,000 other theories you could come up with, including whoever owns the ranch dragging the fucking thing out there for publicity, that would come before aliens came down and, randomly gut a goat for no reason in the middle of Nevada or wherever, and then just fucking aliens? Leave it there. Yeah, exactly. It's even crop circles had a better explanation, because you could be like, well, they're trying to signal something to us, right? They're trying to tell us something, and those were all debunked as well. But there's this great moment where they're talking about this, and Rogan, to his credit, is doing a better job of demanding evidence. He did that program, Joe Rogan Questions Everything, and he met a lot of these UFO people, and he even says on the Knapp interview, a lot of it's just bullshit. They're just fucking weirdos that are just peddling bullshit, and that is, unfortunately, not to talk shit about those people. That is unfortunately the case in a lot of these things. You have people that legitimately think they saw things. You have people that want celebrity. You have people that are legitimately mentally ill too. But they go through this thing where they're talking about these mutilations, and Rogan's saying, where's the evidence? Where's the evidence? And they say, oh, well, we got a photo, and so they, well, we don't know if we should pull it up. It's kind of gruesome. It's kind of, whatever. And then they pull up a photo. Okay, it's like, what is it? All right, it's a photo of a dead animal out in a field. Well, what the fuck does that mean?
Yeah.
What is that? I could walk out to the woods out in front of my house and see that.
Yeah, and a lot of the photos you see in cattle mutilation cases are of just carcasses that have been there a few days. And so bits of them have been eaten away. Right. And the bits that get eaten away are like, the face, like the cheeks and stuff like that. And it's just the way the way maggots attack cows. They lay their eggs in the lips, and they eat away the faces. So it looks like you've got this incision. You look into cattle mutilations from a skeptical perspective. What are the actual explanations? And there are explanations out there for all these things. The FBI did a study of cattle mutilations, not because they thought it was aliens, but because they thought there was some band of satanic, crazy people roaming the countryside, like killing cows, or at least there was concern that this was happening. And they examined like 20, 30 cases and went and looked at the carcasses and examined them, and they said they all had natural explanations. Like every single one of them. Like there was cow was slit down the middle, and that just happens because the gases expand inside the cow and the cow bursts. And there's no blood because it rains. They all had explanations. There were none of these cattle mutilations that were actually mysterious, unless you didn't know much about what naturally happens to a cow when you leave it in a field for 2 weeks.
Yeah, and I think if you really objectively commit to wanting to get to the truth about this stuff, you have to address all of the best points on the other side of the case. As an investor, my podcast is generally focused around finance and whatever other brain farts I have. But, when we look at an investment, or when I personally look at an investment, a company that I either want to invest in because I think they're doing well, or a company I want to short because I think either they're a fraud or there's some type of material misrepresentation or management's bad or something. I always want to hear the best argument on the other side of the coin. If I'm going to buy a company, I want to know the guy very well that hates the company, the smartest guy. Get me the best hedge fund manager with the most assets under management that hates this company, and I need to know exactly what that guy has to say. And I want him to point me to all the evidence he has that this company is a piece of shit. Because I'm interested, and certainly my money is interested, right, in objectively trying to identify whether or not this company will be able to overcome those challenges. Similarly, if I'm going to short a company because I think it's a fraud and I think I've got indisputable proof that this company is fraudulent and that the regulators will eventually make the company go to zero, or it'll go to zero on its own, I want to hear the case from the guy that thinks, wait a second, this isn't a fraud. Here's what you're missing. And what I find in these, when I listen to like 1510 with Knapp and Corbell, and when I listen to Fravor, even there was a point in the Fravor interview where they, I think, brought up maybe something that you had said, or it was in the Lex Friedman Fravor interview, which was subsequent to the Joe Rogan one. So you had your chance to debunk it, and then they bring Friedman brings Fravor back on, and they give him an opportunity to debunk what you said, and he doesn't do a very good job of it. No. And so I just think if you are pushing these stories, don't you welcome the opportunity to address the arguments on the other side of the coin instead of kind of pivot away from them?
Yeah, I certainly would. But I think what happens there is they're already convinced of their own side of the argument. And I think Fravor in particular, Commander Fravor, the pilot, he has a very high opinion of himself. And so he thinks that I must be wrong because, if I'm right, then he was wrong. So he thinks everything I say must be wrong, and so he doesn't even bother looking at it. And so you have him on the Lex Fridman show, and Fridman asks him about the things I said, and he can't really answer any of it, and he doesn't. He just kind of ignores the question. And the same thing with Corbell. He had Chad Underwood, who was the guy who took the video from the Nimitz encounter. He had him on the show. And he, said, "Oh well, let's debunk Mick West," and they started to raise some of the questions. But all Corbell raised essentially was the stupid cold bird thing, and then some other things that weren't even things that I had claimed. Like he said, like, "Oh, could the movement be from the banking of the jet?" And the guy said, "Oh no, obviously not," which is something I would agree with because I never claimed that either.
Right.
So they're not really interested in getting into the actual nitty gritty. Like I have a video about the Nimitz encounter called "No Sudden Moves," which basically goes through the video kind of frame by frame and demonstrates that every time the object appears to move, it's actually the camera that's moving, because you can correlate it with actual changes in the camera from the display and the way the size changes, or that everything rotates, or whatever happens, and that correlates to a movement and then a loss of the lock of the camera. And this one video should really demonstrate that there's nothing going on in terms of this particular video being evidence of a fast-moving craft. But they studiously ignore addressing any of the claims in it. They either kind of hand-wave it away with, "Oh, I know what I saw," or they just kind of pretend it doesn't even exist because they don't really want to get into the nitty-gritty. And it's kind of intellectually dishonest, I think.
Well, it is, and it's like this indignant kind of self-righteous, like, how dare you question me also, too. And that specifically, that Bill Nye example that I brought up with him on Larry King with the 3 naval officers who are, in the sense that they worked for the Navy, they were credible in that regard, but they get to this point, and to the credit of these people, not to shit on them, but, these people may not be well-versed in, how the scientific method works. Mm-hmm. They may not be well-versed in, how legal arguments are made. So maybe they don't understand what proving something beyond a reasonable doubt is. Maybe they don't really understand exactly what, the difference between direct evidence and circumstantial evidence is. Maybe they don't understand what it is that is necessary, in the legal realm or in the scientific realm to make an argument, to go from hypothesis to provable. Maybe they don't understand that body of evidence that needs to get done. But then this diversion of just at one point the guy says to Bill Nye, well, what was it then? What was it then, Mr. Scientist? And that's nothing. That's nothing. That's just a question. That's not, that's not evidence to support your claim. That's evidence that you don't even know what it was.
Yeah, no, it's like people know how to tell a story. Everyone knows how to tell a story. And that's kind of what people default to doing. And they're not really good at questioning things. They're not really good at investigating. They're not really good at comparing different accounts and looking for flaws. So they end up just telling a story. And once you've started telling a particular story, you kind of get stuck with it, and you end up not investigating, but then you end up defending your story, and you end up looking for things that support your story. You don't end up looking for, science is all about disconfirming things. It's all about falsifying things. You try to look at the strongest argument against your hypothesis to try to disprove it. Because if it can withstand that, then it's more likely to be correct.
Right.
But instead, they look for confirming evidence. It's this fallacy of confirmation where you only look for confirming evidence for your story, and you ignore all the evidence that disconfirms it or seems to suggest that some other explanation is more likely. So you see all these people just ignoring the work that I did.
Well, people in the investment community that listen to my podcast regularly know exactly what confirmation bias looks like in finance too, which is essentially, if there are people that will fight to the death for the right to be victimized, they will fight to the death for the right to be wrong, despite demonstrable evidence to the contrary. There's just some people out there that, if the SEC comes out and says the company's a fraud, we're charging them with accounting fraud, there's people that'll go that step further and say, no, it's the SEC's wrong. There's a conspiracy there, too, and then, the Department of Justice comes in. Well, they're in on it, they just take it to the last iteration because they just don't want to be wrong. And it's the same type of confirmation bias, right?
Yeah. It's simple things like the sunk cost fallacy, or the gambler's fallacy, and things like that. People saying, "Oh, yeah, I've got so much money in, I should just write it out," or people saying, "Oh, it hasn't done this for a while, it must do something else." The red hasn't come up for the last 5 spins of the roulette wheel, so the next spin is more likely to be red. Right. It's these fallacies that people have. They're just kind of simple human failings of misunderstanding and emotional engagement with reality that's show up everywhere, and UFOs are no exception.
Is there anything else before we split about Lazar that we didn't get a chance to talk about that you want to bring up, or no?
Let me just think. I got some notes here. Well, he's got an interesting past. I don't know. Yeah, I think people shy away from discussing it, but the fact that just before all this happened, he committed bigamy and his wife killed herself, according to various public documents. What does it say about his state of mind? This is what I've read on otherhand.org, which has references to public court documents. But I think this is, isn't disputed.
No, it's not.
He was married to a woman called Carol, and then he married someone else. And 2 days later, Carol killed herself. It's things like that. And then the other things, I don't want to seem like I'm doing character assassination, but part of his story is that he got a security clearance. And yet there's all these things in his life that kind of would suggest that he perhaps wouldn't get one. And of course, later on, you got the issues of him doing some work with a brothel in some regard and getting arrested for that and got sentenced to 3 months probation. It's just, I think if people want to take Lazar at his word, you kind of have to look at the whole man. If all you have is just him as a person, as being the main reason that you believe it, he sounds like he's telling the truth, which he does. Like, you listen to him and he tells a good story. But look at the broader picture. Look at not just like who he was as a person, but who were the people around him. Look at Leah, look at William Cooper, and look at anybody else who was involved, and look at George Knapp. George Knapp, I think, is a nice guy and very bright, but his whole career seems to revolve around this one case, this whole this Lazar case. So he has motivation to say it's true. Not saying he's lying, but I don't think he has very much motivation to disprove it.
Well, what's interesting is about the affair is there's also this ancillary story that, and you just correct me if I'm wrong, but I remember Lazar saying at one point, I was getting so many phone calls from S4 at night, and I was picking up and leaving at night so often that my wife thought that I was having an affair. Do you know what I'm talking about? He said that several times.
That would have been his second wife, though, wouldn't it?
Correct, yeah, that she apparently, was questioning. And I think that is why he decided to go public, or why he decided to leave, or something. Or why he decided to take people out there to prove that, supposedly on a Wednesday when they were doing these tests. That's another thing, too. He claims, I know the days that they were doing the tests of the craft, so I took people out there to see it, and we've got video of it. Well, there really isn't any video of anything, number one.
Some lights in the sky.
Right, exactly. So he could have very well brought people out the day he knew that, something else was going on. There was, flares going up. Or he could have set something up to, go out there and shoot up in the sky. I mean, you don't know. Interesting, again, we were talking earlier about, all right, like lies may be based on truth. That link of the affair, and then maybe him claiming, my wife thought, and all unsubstantiated on my part, and I don't have any evidence that any of this means anything, and we're not psychiatrists or psychotherapists, so we don't know. But it's peculiar.
He did actually separate from his wife at that time in 1989, just after he was fired, or left, supposedly.
Right. So that might have been it.
And then they were divorced the next year. And then there's some other stuff like there's these other sites that go into more detail about his financial affairs. Like he declared bankruptcy, and then his new wife bought a house in her name, and then after they divorced, she gave him the house because it was really his house. He paid for it. Like a bit of avoiding bankruptcy proceedings there. It's just he doesn't seem like the most reliable narrator of a story because of all these things going on. He was only married to his second wife for like 3 years, I think, or 2 years before they actually split up. So, he had quite a volatile personal life, which may not be any reflection upon him as a person, but it can't help but have an effect on his thinking around that time. If he's just had one wife die and then another one be married to her for 2 years, and then his marriage becomes unstable, and then she leaves him or he leaves her. So I don't know, but obviously this is a minor point. It's just one more thing to consider. You don't want to be saying like, he worked in a brothel once after the fact, therefore he's a liar. That doesn't make any sense. That's not a good argument. But it's worth looking at the broader picture.
You believe that his story is an amalgam of truth and lies?
Well, yes, but I don't think that the truth parts of it are particularly interesting. So it's the interesting parts of it are essentially all lies. His claims that he was hired to reverse engineer flying saucers, I think, are lies. The claims that he observed actual anti-gravity with golf balls bouncing off things, I think those are lies. And I think that the claims that he saw these briefing documents with evidence of government involvement with aliens from Zeta Reticula are also lies. And the truth that's sprinkled in there is boring stuff like he worked in Los Alamos at one point, but mostly lies. And if there's well-told lies.
If there's any evidence to the contrary, any real direct evidence, we would be happy to consider it, right?
Absolutely, yeah, of course. But we're not really seeing it. Now, what we really need to see is I think like what we were talking about earlier, like get into the weeds of what actual science was done. And if you can't do that, why not?
Right.
Is it because you don't understand the actual science, or because there wasn't actually science done, or is there some other reason why you're not talking about the actual science? But right now, it's a guy telling a story that sounds like a science fiction story, and with no actual evidence to back up the reality of that story.
And would you speak to Jeremy Corbell or Bob if they wanted to come on and
Sure, yeah.
either speak to you or speak to you and somebody who's somebody who's got a master's in physics?
Talk to anybody.
Perfect. That's all you need to know. So everything's open for consideration, but as of right now, that is pretty much where we stand. Mick West, my man, thanks so much for doing this, man. Taking 2 hours out of your day to talk to me and for considering it, even though I had to kind of annoy you about it.
Yeah. No worries. It was an interesting journey, actually, like going down the Bob Lazar rabbit hole. Because a lot of it I wasn't that familiar with at all. Like I said, I hadn't really heard of him before that post on Metapunk.
But worth putting down, you think, right?
Yeah, it's worth it, but I don't think we have put it down. I think the stuff that we've talked about today has been talked about before, and it's just like almost like a new generation of people is going to believe Bob Lazar, and then another generation of people is going to think it's full of crap, and you're never going to resolve it.
Well, hopefully the next time bold claims are being made in the absence of bold evidence, which of course is necessary to substantiate bold claims, I would love to have you back on and talk to you about it.
Yeah, that would be great.
All right, Mick West, thank you so much, brother. I appreciate it, and we'll talk soon.
All right, thanks.
Bye-bye. That was the one, the only Mr. Mick West. Happy that he decided to do that today. I really had to annoy him about it for the last couple of months. But this one was more personal for me. I wanted to speak to him about it because I wanted to speak to somebody about it. And I figured if he did some research and looked into it, he'd be a proper person to talk about it. Because you know what? You got to question the answers is what you got to do. And I like doing that. And if the truth is that Lazar fucking worked on alien craft, we'll get evidence of it at some point, some way, somehow. But as for right now, it's not looking likely. Fools, I'm the fuck out of here. Peace.